Hey, what is going on YouTube? It is your boy Pure Neri, and today we're going to be reacting to The Most Brutal Ways to Die by Riddle. Let's check it out.
You've been slashed with a knife, sharp pain in the neck, you're choking on your own blood, and feel like someone pulls your tongue out through a cut in your throat. There's a cage tied to your abdomen, and then someone dumps burning coals into it. The cage gets heated, and the rats sitting inside start frantically gnawing their way out right through your stomach. You're on your knees, surrounded by a crowd. The tire crushes your ribcage and doesn't let you move your arms. Someone's pouring a can of kerosene on you from behind. People have been torturing each other for thousands of years. They invent new methods and instruments to make the pain last longer and be more acute and unbearable. But why? We tend to think tortures were typical of the Middle Ages and Inquisition, but the executioners of that era had enough sources to draw inspiration from. For example, ancient Romans carried out tortures using rats. Just imagine, you're lying on your back with your arms and legs tied up, and a cage full of giant rats is put on your stomach. The executioner throws burning coals on the cage so that it starts heating up. The rats run around their prison squeaking, but there's no chance to get away from the heat, so they start digging a tunnel through your belly. They bite your skin and muscles and rip your bowels apart, making you go crazy with pain. And as if that wasn't enough, here's a cherry on top. The executioner places the burning coals right into the open wound on your stomach. This torture has several variations. Sometimes the cage
Dang. That looks super lethal. I would hate to be any of these people, by the way.
with rats was put on a person's head. Sometimes prisoners were simply locked in a room swarming with hungry rodents. But medieval executioners were worthy successors to ancient Romans. Just take a look at this lead sprinkler. It was filled with molten lead, boiling oil, resin, and even acid. Then the executioner sprayed the liquid all over the victim's naked body. The hot molten lead left severe burns on the skin. To make the suffering even worse, the executioner could pour the boiling liquid on the person's eyes or mucosa. But some really
They did some lethal things to these people.
dreadful forms of torture don't even require weird instruments. A Colombian necktie was a popular means of punishment among drug lords in the 50s. Sometimes this invention is attributed to the famous drug trafficker Pablo Escobar. But in fact, a Colombian necktie already gained popularity when Escobar was only a child. Let's see what it is. At first, the victim had to be immobilized. Then their neck was cut. While the person was choking on their own blood, the executioner stuck their fingers into the wound and pulled the tongue out. If the cut on the neck was vertical, that was a Colombian necktie. If it was horizontal, you had a Colombian necklace. But why did they need to invent such a sophisticated punishment when there's a way to torture someone simply and agonizingly long? Oubliettes are bottled dungeons that were built in medieval castles with one purpose in mind: to hold prisoners. These cells were usually narrow and very deep. Executioners threw victims to the bottom and closed the hatch. Inside an oubliette, there was no place to lie down or even sit. Imagine that you have to stand and can't move a muscle. Hours and days pass, followed by weeks. You can see an exit just a couple of meters away, but there's no way you can reach it. You can only feel a searing pain in your stiff body and in...
What are y'all doing if you're in this position? Can't move, pretty sure I'm gonna try to escape, but that's just crazy right there. Can't even move or anything.
Tolerable hunger. Sometimes spikes were placed on the floor of oubliettes to increase the victim's physical suffering even more. The most frequent guests of these dungeons were captive soldiers, and they stayed there forever. Medieval people were big fans of slow tortures, but it wasn't necessary to dig whole underground dungeons to turn someone's life into a hell. Sometimes all it took was a fork. The medieval Inquisition used a heretic's fork to torture those who practiced the so-called wrong religion. A two-pronged fork was attached to the wearer's throat, with one prong pointing at the chin and the other just above the sternum. The prisoner had to constantly keep their head tilted back. A couple of hours spent in that position brought terrible pain to the neck. But as soon as the victim tried to lower their head, the sharp prongs impaled soft tissues beneath the chin. Some victims attempted to end their suffering once and for all by sharply bringing their heads down, but only made things worse. They didn't die, but continued to bleed as their bodies racked with even more horrible pain. However, cruel, lingering tortures didn't go down in history together with the Middle Ages. In the 60s, in an Arkansas state prison, resident physician Dr. Rollins decided that prisoners weren't punished quite enough. Together with the prison superintendent, they developed the Tucker telephone. An inmate was brought into a hospital chamber. One electrode was attached to their big toe and another to their genitals. Then the physician cranked the handle of the telephone, which delivered electric shocks to the victim's body. But long-distance calls were the absolute worst. During them, several prolonged shocks passed through the inmate until the person lost consciousness. And although this method is utterly sadistic, sometimes executioners went even further. These are crocodile shears, a medieval instrument.
Man, this is a hard video to watch, but this is why you don't go to prison for real, because things they do, if they want to get information out of people, or I don't even know, man. Some of this stuff is pretty gruesome.
Designed for especially brutal torture. It was heated in a fire and then applied to the victim's genitals and clamped shut. This punishment was reserved for the men who tried to assassinate the king. There also was a similar torture instrument made for women. The iron spider was used to rip the breasts from wives accused of adultery. Equipped with 4 iron claws, the device was heated up, and then the women's breasts were fixed onto the claws. They were sharply pulled and literally tore the soft parts off. The victim was bleeding out, and even if she survived, she could still easily die later from all sorts of infections. But don't think these inhumane punishments for misdeeds were only common in the Middle Ages. Until the mid-19th century, in the Russian Empire, guilty soldiers were forced to run the gauntlet. The other soldiers were lined up in 2 rows on both sides of the road, forming a corridor, each of them armed with a pike, a whip, or a club. The victim was stripped from neck to waist and ordered to pass between the double row while his comrades were hitting him from both sides. The severity of the punishment differed depending on the severity of the misconduct. For instance, alcohol abuse led to up to 500 blows, while a soldier who'd attempted to escape got up to 5,000. But sometimes, the torture became a full-scale public execution. The victim was forced to run the gauntlet back and forth and again until he fell to the ground from exhaustion. While the soldier was still alive, his body was put on a sled or carriage, which was sent through the rows as many times as the man needed to finally stop breathing. But the most horrifying part is that running the gauntlet doesn't even rank among the top 3 most brutal torments created by humans. Flaying is one of the oldest forms of torture in history. Assyrians practiced it around 800 years BC. The executioner usually took a sharp knife and made a cut on the victim's shin and hips, then flayed off the skin piece by piece. Sometimes the body was hung up on a hook for convenience, or even impaled. When the whole thing was over, the person was left to slowly die. In most cases, they passed away within a few hours of blood loss or pain shock. But there were occasions when the victim was less fortunate and spent another few days in terrible agony, slowly dying of hypothermia and infections, a frightening end of life. But medieval executioners outdid even the creators of flaying. A rack is a device consisting of a wooden frame with rollers on both ends. The victim's ankles and wrists were fastened to it, and then the executioner rotated the rollers. This pulled the muscles and joints to the point of causing excruciating pain. The person tortured on the rack ended up with countless dislocations, and their muscles stretched so much that they couldn't contract anymore. And as if there could still be any pain tolerance left, the executioner could also burn the victim's flanks with torches, or slide hot coal between their adjacent toes, or simply take pincers and tear out the nails. But the worst thing that the rack torture produced was The sound. The snap of the cartilage getting ruptured, ligaments getting torn, and bones getting broken. Sometimes other prisoners were brought to watch the process, and after they did, they quickly confessed to all their crimes. You may think this is it. There can't be anything worse than this torment. But wait until you learn about necklacing, which was popular in South Africa in the 80s. The victims who had to undergo necklacing were primarily criminals and illegal immigrants. Imagine that an angry crowd gathers around you. Your hands are tied behind the back with barbed wire, and on top of that, a rubber tire crushes your rib cage. The next thing you know is that the crowd drenches you with gasoline, and then the next thing you hear is a cigarette lighter click. A few moments later, a searing pain swallows you completely. Under high temperatures, the tire starts melting and sticking to the skin. You'll stay conscious for only about 20 minutes, burning alive in the molten rubber. Your body will keep smoldering and turning into charred remains for many hours after you actually die. Do you think these atrocities are a thing of the past, even though they happened not so long ago? Let's check when the most recent example of rat torture was recorded. No, it wasn't in ancient Rome. It was in Uruguay in 1985. What about flaying? Mexico, 2010. The Iron Spider, Syria, 2017. So why do people choose to keep torturing each other?
Get out of prison. Nah, but hopefully this video doesn't get demonetized. Like and subscribe. And yeah, more reactions to come. Hopefully you guys have a good day. And yeah, this makes me happy not to be in prison. So